All right, so we have the top 20 albums of April. It was a good month. It was a solid set of releases. I had plenty to choose from. There were even some records that I just didn't have time to get around to. I think the latest Inner Armor record was pretty solid. I was pretty entertained by the latest Vision Bleak album, even if gothic metal is not really my thing. I think Diocletian's latest record is one of their best, and High and Fire put out this really long and probably one of their more interesting records in the last 10 years or so, more recently. So I didn't get a chance to write about those, but I enjoyed each of them, and I think they're worth your time if your tastes veer outside of just the usual uh, thrash, death, black, doom kind of thing. Otherwise, issue number 5 of Mystification Zine is out, and you can jump over to our Patreon and either join to get a copy within 24 hours or whatever of joining, or you can go right to the shop and grab a copy of the latest one. This is just my way of finding a product to give to folks to help support the financial needs of the site, and otherwise, generally just hone some skills in terms of putting together a zine. I would like that eventually to become a print thing, and that's kind of the goal, is to get funds together to make it, at least a yearly print issue or something like that. It does get quite expensive, so that's one of my goals before the end of the year. So join there if you'd like to be a part of that and get a monthly issue. Otherwise, following on YouTube and watching all of the videos is very helpful as always, and I appreciate everyone who works with me and kind of helps me get everything out there. Otherwise, I think for me, this was not a clear choice for album of the month. I really did like Masters Persone from the first time I heard it, from the first time I saw it. A very impressive record. I was, more than grateful to get a chance to premiere one of the preview songs for this album, and from the first listen of that song through the review of the full album, I was just completely impressed with what this band does. This is an Indonesian duo who they've been around for some years. This is their fourth album. I think they had it right on their third album, and this one just revels in having gotten it so right and pushes the limits a little bit more. Focuses on the render of the album a little bit better, and generally presents a more dynamic but still aggressive record in an 80s kind of Black Death feeling style that it's got a sound that I guess most people compare to Obliteration. It's a little bit different than that. There still are thrashing. They are still kind of an old school death metal band in most ways, but not in a very typical way. And I feel like this record had enough of its own personality that I was just consistently excited about it every time I picked it up. And I loved the way that the art kind of interacts with the personality of the record. There's a lot of great kind of drawings and illustrations in the booklet and everything. It was one of the few products like I was really excited to actually get my hands on this year, and it's not been a lot. So that's my highest recommendation of the month, and a great place to start. Now, it's not that I don't like war metal or bestial death metal, but I think that it takes a lot to excite me about it because I've heard so much of it and the innovation is thin. And I think a band like Heresiarch wasn't exactly a band that I expected to surprise me with anything new. Their first record back in 2017 on Dark Descent was solid. It had a lot of personality, but it wasn't exaggerative outside of the second half of the album. And I think that there's been a lot of changes to the band. There's been a lot that happened over the years that eventually funneled into the insight that they find on Edifice. This is their second full-length album, and it's one that it really plays around with pace. I really emphasize that in my review of it, is that the pacing makes the difference here. And I think in a month where people are appreciating what a band like Antichrist Siege Machine does with pace and that kind of grindcore efficacy where they kind of slam through, there's a lot that you would also appreciate about Heresiarch in terms of bringing in some doomed, slower paced movements, some heavier grinding points, and keeping up the aggression throughout. This is a very dark and morbid record that has a tragedian affect to it that is just, it's something else. It really stood out to me, and it was something that I kept listening to over and over because it wasn't so much a puzzle to figure out, but it was this apocalyptic event to witness. And I really had a great time with it and continue to listen to it whenever I get the chance. I'll always be that listener who's always looking for the next great death metal riff, the thrashing side of death metal, and the one that is focused on an obsession with rhythm, that is intricate, expressive. Something that uh, tops the old school style and the high standard of the late '80s and the '90s. And I think a band like Coffin Curse is the perfect combination of all those things that I like about death metal in terms of the rush of it, the adrenaline that goes into this style where it's riff after riff, and they find songs in there too. Now, this is from the guys who are also in Inanna, and that's much more of maybe a progressive death metal feeling thing that has moved towards more of an old school style. And this isn't so focused on the late '80s, early '90s dynamic. They focus on a little bit of the late '90s or just general death metal style, and it allows them to play with dissonance in a certain way. They've got some immolation influences in everything they do, but there's still that death thrash intensity that the first record introduced, and now they're just expanding upon it on this record. And so it's a bit of a rush for me. I don't know if it necessarily tops the intricacies of the first record, but it brings in a lot more effective groove and notions of style and combination that are interesting to me as a fan of classic death metal, as well as just what these guys have done in the past. I think the big surprise this month was Bithos's Chthonic Gates Unveiled. This is the second full-length album from this Finnish black metal band, and it is decidedly melodic. It's kind of a classic melodic black metal feeling, and one that is also kind of morbid in its intent. It's a very aggressive, but not such an elite record that you'd expect. I think Territory Possessions are kind of known for those squarely old school statements and some new ideas applied to that, and this record has a lot of that feeling, but it's very tuneful. It's kind of surprisingly melodic in what it develops. It's kind of an exemplar Finnish black metal album in a lot of ways, but it's not so typical at all. It's kind of got a classic, maybe mid to late '90s melodic black metal feeling to it without the cheesy side effects. So there's this dark, morbid touch to everything that it does, but it's also the tuneful aspect of it only intensifies over the course of the full listen. I was more and more excited about this record every time I listened to it because it intensifies in waves over the course of the full listen. I probably would have done a full review of this, but it came out later in the month and I just didn't have time to get around to it. But this is a very high recommendation. I think this is an essential record for the year in black metal, and one that has only it's only one more favor from me the more I listen to it. Nebulas of Self-Desecration is the debut full-length album from Chilean death metal band Uttertomb. We could call them a bestial death metal band in some respects. They are certainly an atmospheric death metal band in most respects, and this was one of my highest releases for the month because it focused so intently on what this band has always done best, and then it kind of works in a style of incantation-esque death metal that I guess I would accuse a band like Crypts of pioneering in their own aspect back in the mid-2010s, and they found that way of modulating pace and movement in a way that is eerie. It's also aggressive, but it has that kind of bestial atmospheric death metal feeling to it that I like quite a bit without resorting to war metal. There is a kind of an aggressive push to a lot of this record, but they know when to step back and really work on their atmosphere. So this is a great record. I was kind of fighting on where to place it. I think it deserves a higher spot, but I didn't want to over-represent just one record label throughout the whole month. So, it's still up there in the top 5, and it probably would have placed it at number 2 in a different world, but otherwise, this is a great record. Unearthly Litanies of Despair is the sophomore full-length album from Engulfed, and I think this is, it was kind of expected to be pretty good. These guys, they've had such a great track record in terms of full lengths in the last 10 or so years, and the previous, I think, 2017 release from the band was more of a atmospheric kind of Phrenolith-esque sound. It was a little bit more doom-oriented. In some ways, it was certainly more atmospheric in its reach, but for this record, they've gone for a more direct, kind of Morbid Angel kind of feeling sound. This record reminded me of the most recent Gorphilia record in some ways, where they've attuned it more to the riff and the Morbid Angel-esque sound, and there's a very direct, aggressive record. If you're a fan of Diabolizer, which has some of the same members, this is a different kind of point of view, but still the same quality and the same attack of the riffs here. A traditional death metal album in every respect, but one that amps it up a bit. These guys are great at just riff after riff, and it's a great sounding record. It's kind of top notch in that regard. This is the modern high standard for classic death metal sounds, and I think it's just a great record. Evangeli Harold is the sophomore full-length album from Liv Sleda, and this is a Swedish black metal band and a project which is mostly led by a duo as far as I know. It's hard to describe what this record does differently in terms of the first album from the band. In most respects, they return to this fluid, atmospheric, but also semi-melodic style of black metal, which is distinctly Swedish in its formation of statement and movement. There is a little bit of there is a strong melodic component to everything that they do inherently. That is just how they write music, but this is not necessarily a melodic black metal album. It is decidedly atmospheric in that sense. It tunnels into a lot of different areas. It goes for a more aggressive pace a lot of the time here, and even more spaced out moments. So they've intensified what they do in terms of its dynamic, but they've also wandered off into some tangents, which I found a little bit questionable at times, like spoken word samples and things like that, generally distracting from the presentation otherwise. And this was not a huge hindrance to the overall experience, but I don't think it necessarily nailed it like the second album had. As a third full length, I think they're maturing into this sound even more, producing an even better recording quality, or a fitting recording quality, but also meandering a bit in terms of defining the identity of this band. Untouched by Fire is the sophomore full-length album from Arts. This is a British doom metal band, and one that focuses on chorale-style vocals and sort of a monastic style of presentation to present what is essentially a hymnal feature that deals with the history of their region and where they're from. This is a project from Mark Deeks of Winterfelleth, who acts as the keyboardist in that band, and certainly he's found his own sound. The first record really nailed that already, and this is an expansion of that into a much bigger room, a much bigger production value, and a more direct theme. And they're so focused on that theme and that style and that place that it can't help but all feel like it's coming from the same place. And if you're looking for a varietal doom metal record, the first one is more infused with a variety of moods and movements, whereas this record is a much more focused, like I said, it's like a book of hymns that are all focused on developing a story through melody, and that's very sophisticated from my point of view. It's a great record. I think I prefer the first one just a little bit more, but I still love this record. I think it's a very original band, and one that is very emotionally driven, but also performative in a really cool way that speaks to stepping it up in terms of the musicality of a heavy metal style. I think there are times where I'm just excited to talk about death thrash metal. I think late 80s thrash metal, death metal, black metal, and all that is really exciting to me as a subject. So when I get a chance to talk about Pentagram, I might spend an hour talking about their past and all the bands they were influenced by. But when it comes times to talk about their discography beyond the first 7 songs, there isn't that much that's all that interesting. The first record back in 2013 was a new collection of songs along with the re-recording of all their previous material, and I found myself really focusing on that old material that was re-recorded. So this latest record returns with the sound of their debut and just expands upon it with a little bit more of a dynamic recording. It sounds much better in general, but overall they've been consistent. If you liked their 2013 record, this is a repeat of that event, and it does focus on more of a groove-oriented early 90s death metal sound, which still has some of the spirit of the 80s South American black death metal sound in it. So songs like Possessor, I think they'll blow most people away if you're looking for that sound, but it isn't necessarily going to deliver the original sound of Pentagram. If you're still looking for that, maybe that ship has sailed at this point, but this is still a pretty good thing, and I found it was a pretty solid record that I went back to many times. So Maryland-based thrash metal band Nuclear Tomb have sort of what they call a weirdo thrash metal record here on their hands. This is their debut, and Terror Labyrinthian is, in some sense, it is touched by Voivod. That is sort of the thing that's their foil. That's where they kind of start. But before that, they were influenced by stuff like mathcore. And so they're not necessarily a outright technical band. They understand what late 80s thrash metal should sound like, and they're really good at it. There's this huge, aggressive, nuclear kind of thrash metal sound coming from this record, and it's definitely one that is raw, aggressive, swinging in movement. It is much more of a classic pulse to it that is not interested in neo thrash metal style. So if you're looking for something that's authentically influenced by the 80s, this is it, and it's a great record. I think the thing that didn't connect with me was just that it leaned into those swinging sounds rather than the aggressive pulse of things. So there wasn't as much death metal that I expected, but it really did translate the slower pace of their last EP into something much faster, aggressive, and explosive in its experience. So there was a lot to like about this record. I think it's a great debut, and I think that it's lasted a little bit better than a lot of my other choices for this top 20 in terms of the effect of picking it up, having it kind of blow up in my face the way that it does. So great record, great band, and I think they have their minds in the right place for this type of music to where I really appreciate what they do. Kawir is one of my favorite Greek black metal bands, and Kidoimos it's a record that it doesn't necessarily return to their classic sound. It doesn't necessarily repeat what they've done for their last few records, and a lot of that is because they brought in new people in the lineup. They pretty much refreshed most of the entire lineup beyond the vocalist and the main guitarist and songwriter, and so who they've brought in changes their sound quite a bit, and it turns out on keyboards they have Dispater of Midnight Odyssey, and of course this changes their sound in quite a profound way. It not only enhances the atmosphere and the reach of that, it helps them build kind of a folkin black metal touch back into their sound after the last few were a little bit different in style. I really liked the last couple of records for this band, so any amount of change here is not necessarily what I wanted. I wanted them to stay on that thread, but that's not what detracted from this experience. I actually like this record quite a bit. I think it's got a bunch of fantastic songs on it, and it's one of their better records in recent memory. They've been on a pretty big tear since, I don't know, like 2014 or so, with just fantastic records one after another. The one thing that they do on this record that they haven't done in a while is they just put too many pieces on it. It's too long of a record. If we stick around the 45-minute mark, I think that's where this band is at their best. So that's my one complaint. Otherwise, a solid record that really revives and restates the personality of this band in different hands. I think I was a huge fan of Witch Vomit as an old school style death metal band from the Pacific Northwest. It had a slimy, kind of dark death metal sound that developed beyond a Swedish influenced sound early on that had more of a buzzsaw type verve to it on their first record. On this latest record, this third record, they've decided to once again pull from kind of a Swedish zeitgeist for their sound, but this is much more of a melodic black death metal sound, which is less prone to repeat itself. It's both tuneful and riff packed. It's very effective in every moment, and again, it rarely repeats itself, but it also doesn't work in repetition enough to be such a memorable record. It's actually a very short record that cuts through its ideas as fast as possible, really just gets the job done, cuts in and out, and it encourages repeat listen to get back to that one riff, that one, part of the song that might only repeat once. So in a way, they almost shoot themselves in the foot here in that they should have cut into some repetition more to really nail home that style. But the good part is that this will still read like a death metal album and an old school style that is mostly in line with what they've done before, but just has a bit more melody infused into it in a unique way that I'd really appreciate. I really like this direction for the band, and I hope they just do more of it. Vulture is a German speed metal band, and one that is very much classic in their style. They've always been a retro kind of throwback style band. They've always been very consistent. Their songwriting was just a little bit sleepy on the last record, and they pick up the speed on this one. They've got more theatrics on this record. There's a little bit more Slayer on this record in some ways, like early Slayer, like Show No Mercy. And otherwise, this is just, for me, this is one of the best Vulture records to date. I think it's catchier. It's kind of dramatic. It's got a lot of different types of songs. There's maybe even a potential ballad style piece on here. For me, it's the most well-rounded release from Vulture to date, and I really enjoyed going back to it compared to their last two, which weren't as exciting for me. So check this out if you've never really taken a good look at what Vulture does. I think this is one of their better records for my taste, but see if one of their others does it more for you. There is certainly something to be said for being consistent. So this New York death doom metal band, Funeral Leech, have returned with a second album that delivers on everything that they'd built up on their first one. This is a very classic death doom metal style. It does lean into some slower pacing here, a little bit more melody here and there, but as far as what it does different from the last time around, it doesn't really. I think they had it right the first time around. They buttoned it up a little bit more here. There wasn't a lot that was really exciting about them putting out the second record in this line, other than the fact that they had done it again. And for me, that's exciting enough, I know, because I feel like knowing that they weren't a fluke to start was a great thing. But I didn't see a lot of people really talking about this record enough. It is pretty solid, so check it out if you missed it. Australian psychedelic rock / heavy metal band Tarot are back after 8 years with Glimpse of the Dawn. This is a very catchy, tuneful, heavy psychedelic rock record in a very classic style, which is led by two keyboardists. And for me, this was it's a great experience in terms of returning to their sound and finding it developed even more. This was more of a rootsy, kind of raw, occult heavy metal band back in the day when that was a little bit more of the style that was at the time. So this is much more of a fleshed out and mature record, which develops its own style upon return. And essentially, they've done a great job of just writing better songs, having much more to do with the keyboards overall, and presenting vocal melodies and harmonies, which are far more interesting than the more standoffish and raw throwback style of their previous records. So great return, great album art, strong production values. There's nothing not to like about it. Solar Eclipse is the debut full-length album from Nogothula, and I think the way to sell this to most people would probably be is that it features a member of Valdrin, and if you're a fan of that band, you'll appreciate the sort of blackened death metal sound here, which is much more of like kind of the late '90s, early 2000s style of and standard of where black metal was being infused into brutal death metal and achieving kind of a little bit of a new sound for United States, both black metal and death metal audiences. So if you're a fan of Lecherous Nocturne, that's maybe a kind of a classic example of this type of sound. But what they've done here with this is they've worked in more modern black metal influences that help to create their own sound, and they've done a great job for this debut. While I have enjoyed earlier releases from this Chile-based but Venezuelan-born modern black metal band, Selbst, I think this record, it does connectivity right. It finds a way to connect with the audience in the sort of emotionally driven dark metal way that the band always has. They've remained tuneful, a little bit progressive, but still focused on that melodic black metal sound without leaning on the dissonant side of their sound as much. And I think that's a great balance for the band. It's a good vehicle for the songs that they're writing at this point. I did prefer kind of the more aggressive dissonance of the previous record, but I also like that they did something different for this one, something that feels a little bit more authentically just earnest in what it has to say. And also, yeah, there's a couple of just undeniably catchy and surprising moments here where the clean vocals are broken out, or there's just kind of a big riff that happens that makes this album feel like an event. It was memorable for me and worth talking about. So see if that's up to your style. I think if you're a fan of depressive black metal, dark metal, but also dissonant black metal, post black metal, there's a lot that goes into this record that make it feel contemporary and just interesting overall. As a long-time fan of Sarcasm, this Swedish melodic black kind of death metal band, I think it's been interesting to see them develop this oeuvre in their second life. They've worked where they've worked at it for some years since returning back in the 2010s, and this latest record, it really continues down the thread that they've the path that they've followed since reforming. In a lot of ways, this is a little bit more aggressive per a new drummer that they've introduced. In most ways, it's obviously the same main songwriter behind their craft, and by infusing more of a dynamic here, they're veering a little bit away, further and further away from the classic Swedish melodic black death metal sound, and that's not really a hindrance. But this record is it feels like they're returning to the classic sound where they started with, which was a little bit of a dark metal infused melodic death metal sound. Spiritual Apotheosis is the debut full-length album from Portuguese black and death metal band Voidwomb, and this is a pretty interesting record in that it's very tuneful. The rhythms aren't completely formed and rigid, and in terms of the way that they performed them, this feels like a band that they definitely get together and jam on these songs and get the feeling out, and there's certainly a very strong atmospheric touch to everything they do, but it isn't so buttoned up and rehearsed and squared away that it loses its feeling. And so, in a lot of ways, there's a kind of a classic earthen occult death or black metal feeling to this. There is less of a death metal feeling to this record compared to their EP. It's in a lot of ways, it's what surprises around every corner that's interesting about this band. But they do have a couple of flops here on this record, that songs that just didn't really work. But for an introduction, I think they've got their finger on the pulse of what's interesting about black death metal right now in terms of the underground side of things, and that helps them form a pretty genuine article that is worth expanding upon in the future in terms of that kind of psychedelic feeling, the of their atmosphere and the way that translates to occult blackened death metal. And finally, we have Barbarian Swords Feted. This is one of two records that were recorded during the pandemic, and one that this one focuses much more on the blackened doom metal side of their sound, which they're best known for from the start. Their previous record was much more of a blackened thrash metal record. I love that record. I thought it was great. But I kind of almost prefer this side of the band. I do love the blackened doom metal sound of their style. It does touch upon kind of an old school feeling. And this record just kind of sounds great. It's got plenty of riffs. It's got an interesting sort of way of presenting itself. The vocals is kind of over the top. It's just a cool band. And I had a lot of choices that I could have put here, but this is just a band that I particularly enjoy. So check that out if you like the more classic side of black doom metal. Shadow